I'm Gordon Anderson. I'm a professor of labour law here, and after introducing our two speakers, I'll speak briefly and then they'll each follow me. First, can I thank the New Zealand Labour Law Society, whose conference begins tomorrow, for helping support this event, and it was also supported by the New Zealand Centre for Public Law, as you can see on the overheads. So the basic idea of the evening is I'm going to speak first and say a few words about where I see the ILO as being at the moment. Guy will then speak about the past, and Tonia will then tell us all about the future. So our two speakers tonight is, first of all, Dr. Guy Fiti Sinclair, who is a senior lecturer in the law faculty here. Guy joined us in 2014, that long ago, was it? After completing his JSD from New York University. He worked for many years as a corporate and commercial lawyer, and also did an internship with the legal department of the World Bank. Amongst many other things, he's a senior fellow at Melbourne Law School, an external scientific fellow of the Max Planck Institute in Luxembourg for international European regulatory and procedural law, which covers a lot, and he's the associate director of the Centre for Public Law. Guy's written enormously in the area of international law, but his particular work, which is particularly relevant to this evening, is To Reform the World, the Legal Powers of International Organisations and the Makings of Modern States, which was published by OUP in 2017, and which deals with the early decades of a number of international organisations, including, of course, the ILO. This second visitor tonight is Professor Tonia Novitz, who is visiting us from the University of Bristol, where she's a professor of labour law and was a founder of the Centre for Labour Law at that university. She's a graduate of the University of Canterbury, lucky woman, and also of Oxford. She's held fellowships at the International Institute for Labour Studies, the European University Institute, the University of Melbourne and the University of Auckland. She's a member of the Executive Committee of the Institute of Employment Rights and the Industrial Law Society, an honorary member of Old Square Chambers, and as I said, she was one of the two founders of the University of Bristol's Centre for Law and Work. Again, Tonia has written on a large number of international related subjects, including particularly human rights and the right to strike, and more recently has developed or broadened her interest to link into labour law, sustainable development and worker voice, a sort of range of things. So, first up is me. That's the other two, just to remind you. I was going to pose this question: how can an organisation whose structure, mandate and resources were developed almost a century ago pretend to retain relevance and effectiveness in the face of realities that have virtually nothing in common with those of its origins? A lot has, of course, changed since 1919. And the question, of course, is the ILO still fit for purpose? Is its purpose changing to adjusting to the modern world? And how is it evolving to suit the changed economic and political times? And this will be the question that Guy and Tonia will answer later. I'm just going to make some points. The ILO has these three functions, and the first two at least are under a degree of challenge. The ILO's technical and assistance work, of course, is probably not particularly problematical and extremely valuable, and to some extent gets lost, or I suppose, in a debate which tends to be about the political and legal functioning of the organisation. But of course it always has, and no doubt will continue to do very valuable work in those areas. The question around its possible future and so on are really in those sort of first two areas, and in particular whether this magisterial function, the notion that the ILO provides sort of leadership examples and a sort of so on around international law, around international labour law, around labour relations systems and all those sorts of things, is the one that has become increasingly tricky, particularly over the last 2 or 3 decades. What is it, the 30th or 40th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall about now, isn't it? And in particular since that time. Obviously, it's still doing very important work. We've had a new Declaration of Principles as part of the 100th anniversary. There've been the Declaration on Fundamental Principles of Rights at Work, and a lot of other declarations of that sort. But the sort of problem, of course, that it's facing is whether you are getting sufficient traction with these international standards so that they are having a sort of an effective role in countries generally and within the international labour markets in particular. It's also a function where I think the ILO is facing increasing competition. Its major problem, of course, is largely that, of course, it has no enforcement powers. It's a soft law organisation, and therefore, of course, one relies essentially on consent and the willingness of individual states to adopt the various ILO standards. And of course, we see those being adopted in international trade agreements. They get referred to in various agreements. To some extent, they're being used in the things like the Rana Plaza Accord and so on. But again, it's a reference to principles. And one, of course, can legitimately wonder whether what we're seeing is a genuine adoption of those principles, or really a sort of form of virtue signalling that we're referring to these principles, but we're not really taking them too seriously. I'm sure, as most people here realise, there's a big difference between stating that we'll observe ILO conventions, but with no, in a trade agreement, with no particular way of following that up or enforcing it, and that of course contrasts quite significantly with the various financial rules and so on you see in those bodies. The regulatory function I don't think I'll talk too much about. Again, it's a question of whether there's a willingness to use the various processes that the ILO has available to it, and the problem there of course is that a lot of the conventions and so on are not ratified by states, and therefore the ability to monitor and follow them up becomes difficult. Mopane in his book introduces a number of, or suggests a number of tensions that have arisen, and I've summarised them there. The key one, I think, is this question of whether tripartism is still the driving force. Keith Ewing, who's a well-known labour lawyer in the United Kingdom, mentions in a recent article that tripartism seems to be somewhat in tatters at the moment as the ILO goes into its 100th year. And of course we have seen a number of difficulties around that, with the employers caucus at the ILO challenging some of the decisions of the various regulatory bodies in relation to the right to strike. I suppose the issue is there is what I suppose was the key value of the ILO increasingly being overwhelmed by the neoliberal agenda that sort of drives most of the other international organisations and most governments. which is problematical. But the final point I sort of make there, I think, which I'll follow up in a sec, is in terms of actually driving working conditions on the ground, the ILO is somewhat on the back foot given the ability of the international financial institutions to dominate that area. And of course, one doesn't have to look very far to see which vision is the most important there. A quick look, of course, at the Greek situation after the last decade or so will suggest that ILO values weren't the leading ones. Mopane, who of course was the legal officer for the ILO for many years, wrote a very good book on what he sees as the problems with the ILO, but I think at the core of his critique is what I've put up there, that basically that this gamble the founders took on universality and being able to persuade people of the need to adopt proper international labour standards was a gamble that in the longer term may not be playing out as well as might have been hoped. The question, of course, is that arises from that is whether the major political powers ever wanted the ILO to have too significant or strong an international influence. It's quite clear, of course, that if the major powers do want a strong influence internationally, they're quite able to do it. One just has to look at the dispute settlement procedures of the ILO or the various powers available to the World Bank or International Monetary Fund to know that if the major economies want something to happen in international law, they can do it. One suspects they possibly weren't so keen on it in the labour law area. And I'd like to finish by just looking at three growing competitors to the ILO in its various ways. And of course, one of the things that will play out, I suppose, over the next century and possibly over the next decade or so will be just what influence these other bodies have. I've already mentioned the international financial institutions. Another organisation that is increasingly active in the field of international standards, although they prefer to call them international HRM standards, is the International Organisation for Standardisation. That organisation, I'm sure most of you are familiar with it, but of course it has standards from everything from what the size of a tank should be for particular purposes. One of its major innovations, of course, was to standardise the size of containers, which makes much shipping. And their latest one seems to be standards on sex toys, which came out about a month or two ago. So they have a very wide area of interest. But they have, particularly at the initiative of the United States Human Resource Institute, I think it's called, taken an increasing interest in labour standards. And in particular, they've addressed the area of corporate social responsibility. More recently, health and safety at work, and have started to become active in the area of human resource management. And all of those, of course, are areas where there is a degree of overlap and possibly divergence from the ILO standards. The ILO initially worked with the ISO in the formulation of the standards around corporate responsibility, but that seemed to break down over the development of health and safety standards, particularly as the ISO was not particularly interested in a lot of the basic fundamental protections for workers around worker voice and health and safety. And that relationship seems to have collapsed almost completely, I believe. The problem with the ISO is that at least in those sort of areas, it's essentially a money-making organisation. The whole point of the ISO in the management area, of course, is to have lots of consultants who then certify you as meeting the standards, and this is a multi-billion-dollar industry. So the the corporate social responsibility standard doesn't look like it would be carried forward, as it's not a standard in the sense of one that you actually get certified against, whereas the health and safety one is. And the third threat, which is starting to appear on the horizon is private AI, artificial intelligence, HRM systems. And these, of course, are largely derived out of the US and tend to have US employment attitudes embedded in them. The problem with those is that they've ceased to be just management standards, but have become much more aggressively, I think the wording I saw in the article was value-added standards. That is, they're basically standards designed to allow the maximum exploitation from workers. And they tend to, of course, flow their way through various multinational companies or be picked up by employers in different countries in the same way that you pick up Google or Google Documents or something like that, and the various other standards. So there are a number of things going on. I'm just tried to point out some of the tensions and some of the challenges that may be faced in the future. And at this point, as is fairly obvious, I'll turn over to Guy to look at the past as prologue.
Great, thank you, Gordon. It's a pleasure to be here to participate in this event marking the centenary of the International Labour Organization. I'm not here as a labour lawyer, perhaps unlike many of you, but as a public international lawyer who's interested in the history of international organizations and the evolution of international law and the forms and practices of global governance. I'm also not in a position to speak about New Zealand's history of involvement with the International Labour Organization. Of course, that history is long and distinguished. New Zealand was one of the 29 founder members of the ILO. And of course, New Zealand played a pioneering role in social security, which became a core concern of the ILO. New Zealand representatives have attended the International Labour Conference since 1935, and perhaps most notably, Walter Nash was president of the International Labour Conference in 1944, when the famous Philadelphia Declaration was drafted and signed. And here's a photograph of Walter Nash gazing with some intensity into the more affable-looking eyes of Roosevelt, Cordell Hull, looking over the proceedings, and Francis Perkins staring straight into the camera, staring down the cameraman. I also want to mention a visit by Wilfred Jenks, Clarence Wilfred Jenks, who was then the Director General of the International Labour Office, to Wellington in 1972. On that occasion, he gave a talk to the New Zealand Institute of International Affairs on social security as a world problem, which we have in our library in this form. And the director of the Institute of International Affairs at that time, who wrote the foreword, was one Kenneth Keith, who I'm pleased to see is here today again to celebrate this occasion. This talk is intended as a brief survey of the contributions of the ILO to international law and global governance. I hasten to add it's by no means intended to be comprehensive. The possible list of contributions is very, very long. You will probably all know many of the most important conventions on particular issues of labor law better than I do. My focus is really on the contributions of the ILO to international institutional law and practice. And due to the shortness of the time that's been allocated to me, I only have 15 or 20 minutes or so, not the whole evening. There are more distinguished speakers to come, or a more distinguished speaker to come. I will limit most of my comments just to the first few decades of the ILO to consider how the ILO, the early ILO evolved and in turn helped to shape the modern world. So, in its original conception, of course, the ILO was clearly a response to the threat of world revolution. It was born at a time of great uncertainty. European empires were collapsing. World revolution seemed a real possibility. Indeed, revolutions were breaking out all across Europe following the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. For the victorious European, mostly European powers, some kind of compromise with the demands of workers seemed absolutely necessary. As an eyewitness to the negotiations in Paris later put it, the ILO was created as an alternative to violent revolution. However, the ILO quickly evolved in directions unforeseen by its founders. In doing so, it developed innovative mechanisms and programs which foreshadowed in important ways certain practices of global governance that emerged and grew after the Second World War. Of course, it wasn't an easy task to balance the competing demands of workers and the interests of European governments, not to mention important countries outside Europe, such as the United States and Japan. And contrary to the hope of trade unionists, Part 13 of the treaties, which addressed labor issues, articulated labor standards only as a series of general principles, subject to important caveats and conditions. And so the high ideals and goals towards which the international labor movement had been working over several decades were carefully couched in non-binding language. On the other hand, the establishment of a permanent international organization to address labor issues with its tripartite structure was a significant achievement. By bringing together representatives of governments, workers, and employers on a regular basis, the ILO's General Conference came to be seen as a parliament of labor. The formal involvement of non-state actors in creating international standards was a remarkable innovation, and it preceded by many decades similar and more tentative moves in the same direction by other international organizations. Another innovation in the ILO's original conception was the ability of the conference to produce soft law in the form of recommendations, as well as hard law in the form of draft conventions. Additionally, as you, I'm sure, know, Part 13 introduced novel institutional procedures for the implementation of international labor standards, for notification, and importantly, for supervision and accountability. In its early years, the ILO achieved considerable success in producing a series of conventions and recommendations that dealt with core areas of concern, including hours of work, unemployment, maternity protection, the minimum age for employment, and labor inspections. Other innovations emerged from the ILO's practices over the next decade or so. Under the leadership of the charismatic French socialist politician Albert Thomas, the International Labour Office in Geneva grew rapidly and established a network of branch offices and national correspondents in a much more decentralized and networked form or model than the League of Nations. Thomas and his principal deputies, the Irishman Edward Phelan and the Englishman Harold Butler, and other officials from the office, undertook frequent missions to member countries, meeting with trade unions and working through them to generate public pressure on their governments to ratify ILO conventions. Thomas' vision of the ILO as what he called a really living organization thereby led it into an ever-widening sphere of action, including a general economic inquiry into industrial production, fact-finding missions to Hungary and Upper Silesia, and a mission to Russia to gather information on methods of industrial organization. Of course, this expansive approach to the ILO's mandate prompted a certain degree of pushback, as you can imagine. For international lawyers, perhaps most consequentially, the pushback came in the form of a series of legal challenges that were brought in requests for advisory opinions from the Permanent Court of International Justice. And the outcome of these challenges was the confirmation of the ILO's broad mandate to address labor conditions in a variety of circumstances, including agriculture. The advisory opinions of the Permanent Court of International Justice in those cases are seen by international lawyers today as some of the foundational cases of international institutional law. So confirmed, the ILO was by the mid-1920s well placed to launch into a variety of fields of actions. One of those fields, Gordon has already mentioned, was the field of technical assistance. As ILO officials carried out their missions, they were frequently asked to give advice on the drafting of particular pieces of legislation as well as their implementation, and that developed into a regular practice of technical assistance on matters of social insurance law, but also industrial hygiene and factory inspections. But the ILO also started to do this outside of its core European membership. Relatively few of the ILO's original founder members were countries outside Europe, but they did include some important exceptions, such as India, China, Japan, and a number of Latin American states. Challenges from within the ILO's membership, especially workers' representatives from countries such as India, pushed the organization to expand its vision beyond purely European problems of post-war reconstruction. And in 1922, a decision was made to make India one of the members of chief industrial importance with a right to membership on the ILO's governing body. As early as 1928, ILO officials visited Southern Africa, and Albert Thomas began a long mission to the east, including the Soviet Union, Manchuria, China, Japan, the Dutch East Indies, Indochina, and Egypt. ILO branch offices were established in New Delhi in 1929 and in Nanking in 1930. And you'll know, of course, that the ILO did important work in conjunction with the League of Nations on questions of slavery and forced labor in non-European territories. As had happened with their visits to European countries, these occasions created opportunities for the ILO to develop its practices of technical assistance. They also had the effect of broadening the ILO's understanding of labor conditions outside of Europe, starting it on a path of thinking about questions of development and modernization in colonized and later decolonized territories. A further shift in the ILO's center of gravity took place in the aftermath of the Great Depression, this time towards the West. The organization found a willing partner in the administration of US President Franklin D. Roosevelt, as you saw in the earlier slide, and the United States finally joined the ILO in 1934. An immediate reward of that membership was the technical assistance that the ILO gave the United States in setting up the administrative machinery for a key piece of New Deal legislation, the Social Security Act of 1935. Around the same time, the ILO strengthened its existing relationships with member countries in Central and South America, leading to the first Labor Conference of American States in Santiago de Chile in January 1936, and the second in Havana, Cuba in 1939. So here again, the ILO was pioneering a sort of decentralized model of activities that was quite ahead of its time, at least among international organizations. The Great Depression also prompted a move in the ILO towards engagement with questions of economic recovery and planning. Rejecting the principles of laissez-faire economics, Thomas and his colleagues started to advocate strongly for an organized economy, a controlled economy, a planned economy, in Thomas' words, at both a domestic and an international level. Among other things, ILO officials advocated for the 40-hour week and large-scale counter-cyclical public works as ways to alleviate unemployment. As John Maynard Keynes recognized in 1936, the ILO had anticipated his own work in promoting active public investment programs involving concerted international initiatives. In this way, the ILO became both an ardent promoter of the welfare state and a leading site of reflection and innovation that was, at the time, at the vanguard of international economic thought. In the context of its engagement in Asia, Africa, and the Americas, the ILO's interest in economics and planning evolved towards an understanding of, as I've already mentioned, economic development as a part of a wider process of modernization, which then became a mainstream concern and center of activities of international organizations after World War II. The ILO's famous Declaration of Philadelphia, adopted in 1944, there's Walter Nash again, in the background, reaffirmed its fundamental principles while presenting a universal model of social and economic development linked to universal human rights. Here, once again, the ILO found itself at the forefront of international thinking centered on the concerns of working people. That placed the ILO in sort of prime position to emerge from the Second World War as the leading specialized agency of the United Nations. I want to say a few words here to close about Wilfred Jenks, who I mentioned earlier as having visited this institution in this city in 1972. Apart from Albert Thomas, Jenks is perhaps the individual most associated with the ILO in the 20th century. Here he is as a young man studying at Cambridge. He joined the International Labour Office in 1931, and he served there for over 4 decades, beginning in various legal advisor roles, and then as Assistant Director General, and then Deputy Director General, and finally as Director General from 1970 to 1973, when he died. Throughout his career, Jenks made numerous contributions to the office and the organization and to international law. Some of those contributions, he's on the right of this photograph with his eyes closed, happens to the best of us. Some of those contributions were of a routine nature: advice on the drafting and interpretation of ILO standards, participation in ILO organs and committees, technical assistance missions, and so on. Others were more out of the ordinary, even pivotal in ILO history. We might think, for example, of his curation of what was called the Codex of Social Justice, in the form of the International Labour Code in 1939 originally. He was also one of the principal drafters of the Philadelphia Convention of 1944. Here he is with Director General Edward Phelan. He advised on constitutional questions surrounding the ILO's adoption of a revised constitution in 1945, setting it up very well to deal with the concerns of the post-war era. He wrote an important memo a few years later on the ILO's capacity to undertake operational activities. And through the 1950s and 1960s, he dealt with difficult membership questions arising in the context of decolonization and the Cold War, including especially thorny issues involving the membership of South Africa, the Soviet Union, and the United States. But Jenks was also a legal innovator beyond the ILO, as I mentioned. He was deeply involved in the establishment of the United Nations family of international organizations. He attended the San Francisco conference as well as the Bretton Woods conference as ILO delegate, and made important contributions on a number of issues, including the international character of UN staff. He also attended the conferences to establish or to re-establish a number of specialized agencies, both as a representative of the ILO and as an expert on constitutional questions. He made significant contributions thereafter to establishing a pattern of relationships among the new international organizations, especially within the UN family. He drafted the first relationship agreement between the United Nations and a specialized agency, obviously the ILOs. And then he actively engaged in the work of the UN Administrative Committee on Coordination in the crucial post-war years and decades. The extraordinary volume of his and range of his scholarly writings, and it truly is extraordinary considering that he worked a full-time job, is well known among international lawyers. He wrote important works on international labor law, of course, but also on the law of international organizations. I have argued in an article that he was really a pivotal figure in establishing the law of international organizations during World War II and in its aftermath. He wrote on space law. He wrote on the law applicable to the Antarctica. He wrote on international adjudication generally, and much, much more. His legal practice at the ILO and his engagement in the issues of his time facing the ILO deeply informed his scholarly writings, both those of a sort of doctrinal nature and those of a more theoretical nature, such as this, his most famous work, The Common Law of Mankind. To conclude, so the ILO, the international law and the world are all facing severe challenges, I would say, today. Gordon has already presented some of them to us. Perhaps Tonia will present some more. We might leave the room a little depressed. But the challenges, these challenges, of course, are different from those that were faced by the world a century ago at the founding of the ILO, and also very different from those faced 75 years ago at the end of the Second World War, when Jenks did so much to help the organization transition into a new international system. Today, we're faced with a complex and perplexing combination of interconnected crises, accelerating climate change and environmental degradation, extreme inequalities of wealth and opportunity, internal state conflicts that are driving massive displacements of populations, and a disturbing recrudescence of nationalism, xenophobia, and authoritarian politics. These and other challenges come at a time when, unfortunately, trust in the capabilities and even the motives and integrity of international organizations is under strain for a variety of reasons. Now, as in previous moments of crises, the challenge for the ILO is to reflect on what steps it can take and how it may adapt to meet the pressing needs of the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Guy. And now Tonia will speak to us about making the ILO sustainable and other matters.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to speak here in such distinguished company, and also to celebrate the centenary of the International Labour Organization. And today we're not even just celebrating that centenary in general, but I think it's actually the 100th birthday of the very first ILO convention on hours at work, so we can celebrate that too. But I suppose that takes us back to Gordon's first question, and this question of what we do 100 years on. So the ILO can be evaluated on the basis of its past deeds, and as Guy has demonstrated, those are extensive. But is it really a living organization in the way that Albert Thomas would have wanted it to be at this stage? So today I want to talk about that buzzword, sustainability or sustainable development. And I want to probe what it might mean and what it might mean for current ILO activities. And I want to discuss the significance of sustainability objectives for the ILO in the 21st century beyond that synonym of sustainability, bare durability. So it's not enough to last for another 100 years. What is important is what the ILO does with the time ahead. So there are three parts really to my paper. The first touches on the potential meaning of sustainability, and I'm looking at that particularly in the light of the 2015 UN Resolution on Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. And why is that important? Well, I think that there are various difficulties and flaws with Agenda 2030, but it is our political accommodation between the global north and the global south with a degree of unanimous force behind it. It's a huge compromise. In some ways, like the Declaration of Philadelphia was a huge compromise, but also a statement of positive intent. And it seems to me that it's a nice starting place to think about ideas of justice and what the ILO could actually do. So let's talk a bit about sustainability. And then I'm going to look at the role of the ILO in promoting sustainability. So SDG 8 adopts this ILO term of decent work that comes out of the 2008 ILO Declaration on Social Justice for a Fair Globalization. But I'm going to suggest that SDG 8 shouldn't be all that the ILO is concerned with. That there are elements of procedural justice, particularly in SDG 16, which are important, and also there are synergies between the different SDGs that need to be explored. And that could be done through forms of procedural participation and engagement under SDG 16. Then beyond that, I wanted to give you a glimpse of what the ILO is trying to do in 2019 regarding sustainability. So I'm going to be looking at the ILO Global Commission on the Future of Work and their publication of a report on work for a brighter future, the ILO Centenary Declaration of the 26th of June of this year, and the perhaps more interesting International Labour Office report, Time to Act for SDG 8, which actually does start to deal with broader issues of social justice beyond SDG 8. So I suppose what I'm arguing in this little brief paper is that for the ILO to be truly sustainable in the future, it actually needs to open up space for participation by a wider group of those at work than is currently contemplated under ILO structures. And also to address some of the pressing issues, for example, regarding global inequalities and also climate change and environmental crisis that Guy highlighted, we need to expand the legitimate concerns of collective bargaining and industrial action, and the legitimate subject matter of ILO standard setting. So that's what I'm going to be suggesting. Right, so the potential meaning of sustainability. Well, as I said before, you could regard longevity or durability as synonyms for sustainability. But I think that sustainability is meant to connote more than that, that it's meant to be about justice, both intragenerational and intergenerational. And also we might want to recognize its different dimensions, economic, social, and environmental, which are also recognized in the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. So the challenge for the ILO in sustainability terms is to provide justice by serving the needs of both present and future generations. So we could think about intragenerational justice as being concerned with the contemporary generation of those engaged in work, as well as current employers and governments. And intergenerational justice as meeting the needs of future generations, of workers, but also other citizens. Now, historically, discussion of sustainability or sustainable development has been just focused on future generations, and really it's been aimed at preserving the environment with some integration around economic development, but very little recognition of social concerns. What is interesting about the SDGs is this explicit recognition of social concerns that actually go beyond just labour rights as human rights. So they go beyond the scope of the 1998 Declaration. And it's true that various scholars have been concerned by this and see it as a dilution of the concerns around work that we might see as pressing. But you could see it as a kind of expansion. In Agenda 2030, the three main facets of sustainability, economic, social, and environmental, are seen as intersecting, and they're described as indivisible. My proposal is that the social can be viewed as being of joint importance with the other pillars, and there will often be important intersections between the two, but it can sometimes take priority as a reason for action. And I think that argument can be demonstrated most neatly by the example of child labour. So there's provision made for the eradication of the worst forms of child labour in SDG Target 8.7, which is not surprising because it links to the ILO Declaration 1998. and also a determination to put an end to the abuse, exploitation, trafficking, and all forms of violence against and torture of children in SDG Target 16.2. These are measures which promote intra- and intergenerational justice, because we regard children suffering abuse and their children as our present and future generations and a matter for serious concern. But it's clear in these instances that although we're going to pay attention afterwards to issues around the environment and how we would achieve this through environmental means, and also, obviously, economic development is going to be crucial, there is still a pressing social ambition that's leading the way here. And I think that it's important to see the social as part of a sustainability agenda. Many SDGs are relevant to those at work. So obviously SDG 3 around health, SDG 5 concerned with gender equality, 6 concerned with water, 7 energy, 8 is obviously decent work and economic growth, but 10 inequality between and within states. All of these intersect to affect the lives of working people in a variety of ways. But we can see the operationalization of SDG 8 and all SDGs as being linked by a desire for participatory justice. And this is set out in SDG 16, which seeks to promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, provide access to justice for all, and build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. Now that is a signal, I think, to the ILO, which could be seen as an effective, accountable, and inclusive institution. But there's possibly more than that that's going on here. SDG Target 16.6 talks about these effective, accountable, and transparent institutions. SDG 16.7 says what we need is responsive, inclusive, participatory, and representative decision-making. And that fits with the ambition of participatory inclusivity that's there in the Rio Declaration in 1992, and also the Aarhus Convention of 1998 around environmental objectives. So freedom of association, collective bargaining, and worker participation is, I suppose, indirectly recognized by SDG 16.7, and what has been said by the 2018 report of the Special Rapporteur on the Rights to Freedom of Peaceful Assembly and Association is that freedom of association has to be read into SDG 16.10, and of course it's there in the background and the targets for SDG 8. So it might now be time to revisit ILO systems for participation to make sure that they can actually meet the challenges of compliance with contemporary demands for just government. And that really has two facets. We need to ask who is being given voice now within ILO tripartite mechanisms. And one of the problems that the ILO faces today is that it is progressively less and less representative of people at work. We're seeing an ever-increasing precarious workforce that's being denied access to protection by labour standards on the basis that these people are not truly workers, or they're not workers entitled to make claims. And that is the case in various countries for agency workers, for migrant workers with varying degrees of immigration status, 0 hours workers, and various forms of gig working. Informal labour markets have long been present in the so-called developing countries in the global south. It's now becoming an entrenched feature of the global north. So we're seeing a transition within the labour market and progressive exclusion of various people from access to trade union representation on the basis that they are simply not regarded as being workers who have that legal status. So what do we do about that? Well, we could radically redesign tripartism. We could change it so that we give NGOs who represent new forms of work greater voice at the ILO. But The difficulty with doing that is at the moment you have a fairly neat power balance that operates at the ILO. In some ways, tripartism is breaking down because of employer rebellion and employer power. But if you imagine diluting that further by introducing NGOs and then also lacking the accountability that comes with trade unions as worker organisations, NGOs don't have a membership to which they're accountable in the same way, that becomes fairly tricky. So although it's being explored and NGOs are gaining a greater voice within the ILO and there are all sorts of coalitions which are taking place, it's very difficult to think that we'd simply abolish tripartism. An easier answer would be for the ILO to be active in broadening the membership of worker organisations to reach beyond traditional remits, the old standard employment relationship, and to revisit the ILO recommendation of 2006, which sets out those parameters. Now, the ILO supervisory bodies, the Committee on Freedom of Association and the Committee of Experts, have themselves said freedom of association is a human right, and the right to engage in collective bargaining and the right to strike should be exercised by people regardless of their formal employment status. But as you know, there is considerable political resistance within the ILO to expanding the membership of trade unions to make them more effective as political actors. The second issue is what issues can be addressed through any form of collective voice. Does it include the kinds of concern with climate change and global supply chains which dominate contemporary labour market debates? Well, there is a difficulty here as well. At the moment, we are so absorbed with trying to protect the existence of a right to strike within the ILO and to get employers on side for that, we're not really thinking about revising ILO standards to ensure their contemporary relevance. So in the past, there have been important coalitions between, for example, trade unions and domestic worker NGOs to try to push through ILO standards on domestic work. But it's going to be interesting to see whether that can also be achieved in the context of environmental NGOs and climate change action. It would be helpful also to think about revising ILO standards, not just about the limits of the legitimate limits of worker interest, so short-term economic and social interests rather than longer-term climate change interests, but also to think about the limits of primary and secondary action. So the ILO has a standard which says that secondary action, sympathy strikes are lawful to the extent that they support lawful primary action. And that's dependent, obviously, on the laws in any given member state and whether or not they comply with ILO standards. It would be helpful if the ILO standards could entail greater tolerance of secondary and transnational action, not just where the primary action is lawful, but where it's taken against a lead firm within a global supply chain, which is in violation of social or environmental standards. So these are the sorts of things that could happen, but they're still looking unlikely, and we're not really seeing the probing and discussion of that we might hope for. So the question is, I suppose, what happens next? What is the ILO actually doing in 2019? Is it beginning to address these issues around institutional effectiveness and voice? Well, up until 2019, ILO engagement was very much focused on bridging the gap between environmental and labour concerns. So the ILO has been active on promotion of green jobs, and also with the Just Transition Guidelines of 2015, just transitions for workers within this context. The guidelines of 2015 are important, I think, because they demonstrate how environmental concerns raise profound distributional issues around wealth and the effects of environmental change. and how they require engagement with representative stakeholders, including worker voice. So there's a really important provision there for social dialogue and tripartite policies. In 2019, the ILO has actually gone further than this, and the Global Commission report on Work for a Brighter Future is interesting because it starts to refer to an idea of sustainable work. So this is work which has intra and intergenerational effects, and where this issue of social justice is given, which is a long-standing principle within the ILO, is given renewed meaning. In particular, what the Global Commission report did was advocate a universal labour guarantee. And this envisaged that all workers, regardless of their contractual arrangement or employment status, must equally enjoy adequate labour protections to ensure humane working conditions for everyone. And that was to cover the core labour standards, including freedom of association and collective bargaining, that come out of the 1998 Declaration, but also an adequate living wage, limits on hours of work, and safe and healthy workplaces. And what the Commission expected is that there would be a floor of protection that could then be raised by collective bargaining for everybody at work. So that's a fairly radical idea. And what was interesting, what everyone eagerly awaited, was the ILO Centenary Declaration of the 26th of June of this year, which was going to convert this universal labour guarantee into something more meaningful. Well, Article 1C of the Centenary Declaration did acknowledge explicitly the significance of sustainable development and its fulfillment through, in paragraph E, full, equal and democratic participation in ILO tripartite governance, which suggests an expanding membership. But Article 3B of the Declaration was disappointing. It explicitly reaffirmed the continued relevance of the employment relationship. It recognised the rights of all workers to their fundamental rights, to the minimum wage, maximum limits on working time and health and safety. So there's an attempt to retrench there and to go back to thinking about status as workers and the employment relationship again. There was reference to freedom of association and collective bargaining, and they were treated as important enabling rights alongside social dialogue and tripartite cooperation. But there was an absence of any clear guidance as to how you'd get to this extension of participatory inclusion in ILO standard setting. The drafting of the International Labour Office report, Time to Act for SDG 8, didn't require consensus at the International Labour Conference and could be bolder. The office appreciated the overlap, or what it called dynamic linkages, between SDG 8 and SDGs 1, 3, 4, 5, and 16. I think there's even more that you could find in terms of dynamic linkage, but it's a really good start. And also, the office stressed that collective bargaining and social dialogue were vital to achievement not just of SDG 8, but Agenda 2030 as a whole. They wanted an expansion in trade union membership and representation, but they didn't mention the right to strike or the content of collective bargaining. So what the office report did is it talked about emergent non-standard work and also particular vulnerabilities that were caused for female and migrant workers. And they said this made it imperative to build the capacity of trade unions to represent workers in non-standard employment arrangements, but the report didn't spell out the mechanics of doing this. So it's going to be interesting to see how the high-level political forum, which is responsible for coordinating responses to reports on the SDGs, will actually treat SDG 8 and think about this approach. To conclude, I suppose if sustainability meant durability, at its centenary, the ILO certainly meets that criteria. if we're thinking more about inter and intragenerational justice, including participatory engagement for everyone at work, there's probably a lot more that could be done. There's scope to find space for a wider range of voices at work and collective worker activities under an ILO tripartite framework. And to do so really would, I think, engage protection of decent work and pursue a broader sustainability agenda. So demands for inter and intragenerational justice, together with prompts in the SDG targets, could assist the organisation in addressing issues of effectiveness, accountability, inclusion, participation and representativity. And I think ultimately the problem is that the survival of the ILO is likely to depend on those types of reform. But at the moment, the role of the employer group within tripartism looks set to block that. And I think to go back to Gordon's point about the international financial institutions, and here I'm ad-libbing, I'm going away from my presentation, I just wanted to follow up on what he was saying. I think there is now a kind of nascent response from the international financial institutions which suggests that the systematic impoverishment of working people is not going well for capitalism. Okay? And so it's interesting seeing the World Bank report on the changing nature of work and a recognition that there has to be investment in human capital. I mean, it comes from the wrong place, but it is about, providing healthcare and education to create productivity, but also to create an income base, because you need consumers for capitalism to work. And it's interesting seeing the OECD doing something, the same. That the Employment Outlook in 2019 on the future of work, 345 pages of this, talks about fiscal sustainability and the importance of a social security system, but is also interested in this grey area, they describe it as a grey area, of workers who are not treated as workers and don't receive any meaningful income. So it's interesting that there will be forces outside the ILO which may allow this stance of the employers group gradually to change and might in the longer term, here I'm trying to end on a positive note, guys, and may in the end affect something that is meaningful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone, for coming out this evening. I'd like to thank our two speakers on your behalf again. It's been a fascinating discussion. Perhaps we'll be here again in 100 years, perhaps we won't. Perhaps someone else might be. But nevertheless, we were looking at what, of course, is the longest lived international, well, one of the longest lived international organisations. I think the International Postal Union's been around longer. But particularly one of the ones on this scale. It's sort of seen one war, two Bolshevik revolutions, and possibly a big event next year. So obviously we should celebrate its centennial. Hope you can join us outside for a reception. But once again, can we thank our two speakers who I just filled in.